In the last video, we learned that General Zarov, he had a little crazy to him. If you remember, he was an accomplished hunter who had hunted every big game animal there was on this earth, and he found himself completely bored, even when he was laid up inside of a tent after being almost gored through by a Cape buffalo. So we see that he's having dinner with Sanger Rainsford, who is also an accomplished hunter who's known for his travels and his books. And Rainsford was on the way to the Amazon to hunt the Black Panther. Nah, we're not talking about the Marvel comic. We're talking about the stealthy, sleek, beautiful animal that can blend very well into the shadows of the jungle down in South America. But he gets a little sidetracked when he loses his pipe, falls into the water, and has to swim his way to the island. There, he meets his host, General Zarov, who, for all intents and purposes, comes off as a very civilized person. However, there lies a thin layer between him and his savage interest, which we know now, after being part of that dinner, is hunting other humans. Oh, man. All right. So, of course, Rainsford has a problem with this. He's like, you know what? I'm going to go to bed. You have fun. And that is where we left off. So, really quickly, if you don't remember, I am Miss Cannon, your online ELA teacher, and this is Miss Cannon Teaches ELA. So we are reading The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell, which was written 100 years ago in 1924 and examines a lot of really deep thematic problems that we have, such as the difference between civilization and savagery, good and evil, so to speak, but some other really tough questions that we're going to dive into for the rest of the story. The biggest question, if you remember, is what happens when the shoe is on the other foot? And so when we started part one, we were talking about how fun it was to go hunting, and the sailor Whitney raised the question, but is it fun for the animal? To which Rainsford said, who cares? They don't have feelings. Well, y'all, that shoe is about to definitely get on the other foot. And let's see if Rainsford's beliefs hold up after we're done with this story. So let's go ahead and pull up the story so that we can get on into this. In the last video, we talked about foreshadowing, which is, again, if you recall, is the hinting that goes forward, right? Like, right now, for instance, with this light, I'm casting a shadow behind me. And so that's not making a prediction. That is honestly, the shadow is kind of the thing sort of in the past, so to speak. But foreshadowing, for meaning before, foreshadow means that there is this knowledge, this hint, this awareness that is over what has not yet happened, right? So we already knew from the foreshadowing we've done, the name of the game, the name of the story is The Most Dangerous Game, right? Game being a double entendre. Double entendre is a French word, and it means double meaning, right? So we have game, which is, fun. Hunting, for instance, is considered a game, a sport. But then there is game, which means big animal, such as the panther or tiger, an elephant. So the most dangerous game holds two different meanings. It's the most dangerous animal, and it's the most dangerous sport. And here, our story is actually encompassing both, right? That was double entendre, foreshadowing, again, the name of the island, Ship Trap Island. We already know it's the most dangerous game from the title. We know that there were gunshots. We know that there was an animal we never heard of before. So we had all these things that came before that later paid off, right? When we sat at that dinner, we came to understand that, yeah, there was some pure savagery here on this island taking place. General Zaroff was a madman, right? So that foreshadowing has paid off so far. There's still more to go. And then we also talked about conflict. Now, conflict meaning the obstacle to the protagonist's goal, right? And so the protagonist, again, is our main character, the person who the story is mainly about, whose journey we're watching through the whole story. Doesn't mean the good guy. In this case, it could be that, but the obstacle to that person's goal, that thing's goal, the protagonist's goal, that is conflict. Well, conflict has 6 different types. Man versus man versus nature, man versus society, man versus self, several different types of conflict. But so far, what we are dealing with is, so far, what we've seen is man versus self, right? So we saw when Rainsford had to swim through that blood warm water, we saw that he was really tired and very close to giving up. And he had to talk to himself, like, just keep going, just keep going. But there was also that fear that he wasn't going to make it because he didn't know where he was, right? So that's man versus self. The goal is to survive. The obstacle is, I don't think I'm gonna make it. Like, that's what's coming up. So that's the conflict. But now we're also about to approach another type of conflict. Can you guess what that conflict will be? Again, take into account everything that we've already seen, everything we've already heard, and the things that we can guess are coming. You're probably right, right? We are going to be dealing with man versus man. Again, we use that word in general. It doesn't actually mean a man or any kind of binary thing. It just means a human person versus another human person. So that's when we have 2 direct people against each other. And in this case, it's going to be our protagonist, Rainsford. It's going to be our protagonist, Rainsford, versus our antagonist, which is going to be General Zara. I'm pretty sure we get that, right? And so antagonist, again, anti meaning the opposite or against. And so an antagonist is someone who brings obstacle to, or someone or something that brings obstacle to the protagonist's goals, desires. All right. So the final thing, I think it's the final thing that we talked about was imagery. And I just used an example when I was talking a little bit earlier when I mentioned man versus self, and that was the blood warm waters of the Caribbean. So imagery is literally a compilation of words, the arrangement of words that brings to mind a picture. Like, it paints a picture, it gives us the sound, it really just like wakes up our senses so that we can see, hear, smell, what have you, by recalling the things that we already know. That's why it's really important to have prior knowledge, because they usually come into play when we're reading, right? Because it adds a different layer, it adds more depth. So if we're talking about blood warm, then we should have an idea that blood itself is warm and thick, and that, it tends to be unusual for water, especially if you're in the north, but down in the Caribbean it would be warmer. So this is just, the imagery is also adding to our foreshadowing because of the type of word being used. I'll introduce another term here, and that's going to be diction, right? So diction means the words used, basically dictionary, right? But the type is what we're dealing with. And so it's a very creative, very sensorial type of diction. It just it evokes the senses. So blood warm waters was one of them. When we talked about the night, they were talking about how suffocating it was, like a velvet blanket, and so that's what imagery is. Imagery paints the picture. Imagery takes us from just looking at black squiggles on a screen or on a page and awakes awakens our imagination. So those are some of the main keys that we talked about, key terms that we talked about in part one. Let's dive into part two. Those things are going to continue. And then we're really going to be diving into also our plot diagram. We talked about the exposition, which is where there's honestly like the explanation of the story that we're getting ready to really dive into. And that usually includes our characters. So we have our main characters, protagonist, antagonist, our setting. We know that we're in this foreboding type of place, right? It's very ominous. It's very dark. It's very obscure, unclear. It's filled with forest. There's no pathway that has been described as of yet in the story. So it's very tangled and gnarled and just uninviting, right? So we're in a very unfamiliar, uncomfortable type of place. So that is the setting that and setting honestly plays another character in a story. So it's almost as if the island itself is a character in this story. It would be a static character. We'll get into those terms in later videos, but static meaning not changing. The island doesn't change. And then the problems being introduced. And so we're really going to be at the end, sliding into rising action. So we're going to be at the end of exposition, sliding into rising action in the next couple of minutes, because we got to get to what the problem is. And we know essentially, or at least we thought the problem was going to be, right? How to get off the island. That seems like a really huge problem, but that problem is not going to carry us through the story. So that's not the actual problem we're here to solve. The problem we're here to solve needs to carry us all the way through the story. Let's go. All right. So again, y'all remember, I don't do voices. We're just going to jump on in and get started with the reading. And let's again pick up at the line that says, the bed was good. Here we go. The bed was good, and the pajamas of the softest silk, and he was tired in every fiber of his being. But nevertheless, Rainsford could not quiet his brain with the opiate of sleep, opiate being a drug. Once he thought he heard stealthy steps in the corridor outside his room. He sought to throw open the door. It would not open. He went to the window and looked out. His room was high up in one of those towers. The lights of the chateau were out now, and it was dark and silent. But there was a fragment of sallow moon, sallow meaning pale, and by its wan light he could see, dimly, the courtyard. There, weaving in and out in a pattern of shadow, were black, noiseless forms. The hounds heard him at the window and looked up expectantly with their green eyes. Rainsford went back to the bed and lay down. By many methods, he tried to put himself to sleep. He had achieved a doze when, just as morning began to come, he heard far off in the jungle the faint report of a pistol. So this chunky paragraph here gave us a few clues of what's going on. First off, he heard footsteps by his door. And then when he went to go open the door didn't budge. So we can assume they actually locked him in, right? So then he was like, okay, I gotta get out of here. And he goes to the window, but guess what's waiting? So he can't get out the window. Those very hungry hunting dogs. So then he tries to sleep, but it's really hard to sleep when you're about to doze off and you hear a gunshot, meaning the last person that was hunted did not make it. All right, so Rainsford's getting a little uneasy. We can use that euphemism. Rainsford's very uneasy. He had not been able to sleep the whole night. And again, things were starting to shape up in a way that's giving him clue of like, this is not going to be what I want it to be, right? So General Zaroff did not appear until luncheon. He was dressed faultlessly in the tweeds of a country squire. He was solicitous about the state of Rainsford's health. And solicitous means he just asked him, how are you? You know, he inquired about it. He was very, very concerned, you know? And I'm sure Rainsford looked horrible. The man did not sleep, so his bags had to be big up under his eyes, right? So, as for me, sighed the general, I do not feel so well. I am worried. Mr. Rainsford, last night I detected traces of my old complaint. To Rainsford's questioning glance, the general said, in you, boredom. Now, that's how you pronounce it. I don't know. So, uh-oh. That doesn't bode well, y'all, because again, going by the foreshadowing, it is through boredom that he came up with this game. And now he's starting to feel bored again, hunting people who he's seeing as the scum of his earth, scum of the earth. So, can we make a conjecture? Can we guess that something's going to change about this game that we don't actually? Hmm. All right, let's continue. Then, taking a second helping of crepe Suzette, the general explained, the hunting was not good last night. The fellow lost his head. He made a straight trail that offered no problems at all. That's the trouble with these sailors. They have dull brains to begin with, and they do not know how to get about in the woods. They do excessively stupid and obvious things. It's most annoying. Will you have another glass of Chablis, Mr. Rainsford? I don't drink, so if that's how you pronounce it. General, said Rainsford formally, I wish to leave this island at once. The general raised his thickets of eyebrows. He seemed hurt. But my dear fellow, the general protested, you've only just come. You've had no hunting. I wish to go today, said Rainsford. He saw the dead black eyes of the general on him, studying him. General Zaroff's face suddenly brightened. He filled Rainsford's glass with venerable Chablis from a dusty bottle. Tonight, said the general, we will hunt, you and I. Rainsford shook his head. No, general, he said. I will not hunt. The general shrugged his shoulders and delicately ate a hothouse grape. As you wish, my friend, he said. The choice rests entirely with you, but may I not venture to suggest that you will find my idea of sport more diverting than Ivan's? Y'all know what he just said, right? He nodded towards the corner where the giant stood, scowling, his thick arms crossed on his hogshead of chest. Oh, mean, cried Rainsford. My dear fellow, said the general, have I not told you? I always mean what I say about hunting. This is really an inspiration. I drink to a foeman worthy of my steel at last. The general raised his glass, but Rainsford sat staring at him. You'll find this game worth playing, the general said enthusiastically. Your brain against mine, your woodcraft against mine, your strength and stamina against mine. Outdoor chess. And the stake is not without value, eh? And if I win, began Rainsford huskily. I'll cheerfully acknowledge myself defeated if I do not find you by midnight of the third day, said General Zaroff. My sloop will place you on the mainland near a town. The general read what Rainsford was thinking. Oh, you can trust me, said the Cossack. I'll give you my word as a gentleman and a sportsman. And of course, you in turn must agree to say nothing of your visit here. I'll agree to nothing of the kind, said Rainsford. Oh, said the general. In that case, but why discuss that now? 3 days hence, we can discuss it over a bottle of Venu Clicquot, unless the general sipped his wine. Then a businesslike air animated him. Yvonne, he said to Rainsford, will supply you with hunting clothes, food, a knife. I suggest you wear moccasins. They leave a poorer trail. I suggest, too, that you avoid the big swamp in the southeast corner of the island. We call it Death Swamp. There's quicksand over there. One foolish fellow tried it. The deplorable part of it was that Lazarus followed him. You can imagine my feelings, Mr. Rainsford. I love Lazarus. He was the finest hound in my pack. Well, I must beg you to excuse me now. I always take a siesta after lunch. You'll hardly have time for a nap, I fear. You'll want to start, no doubt. I shall not follow till dusk. Hunting at night is so much more exciting than by day, don't you think? Au revoir, Mr. Rainsford. Au revoir. General Zara, with a deep, courtly bow, strolled from the room. Y'all, what? Listen, let's back it up a little bit because there's just stuff to cover, okay? So it just said, he, General, just said, you'll find this game worth playing. So he's childishly excited now because he's not hunting sailors. Like, why would sailors know how to get through the woods when they are literally people who know how to get through the water? So, yes, they weren't a match for him. But now he has one of the greatest hunters, the guy who wrote about it in the book, who has hunted almost every animal that he has hunted. You know, I think he's just missing the panther, possibly that buffalo. I don't know if he hunted the buffalo, but you know, the panther was considered like literally a very dangerous game. It was a shadow that moves through the trees in the rainforest. And so now he's extremely excited because Rainsford really would be considered the most dangerous game for him. Zaroff is indeed the most dangerous game for Rainsford. He's never hunted a human before. And between the two of them, the protagonist and the antagonist, this is a dangerous game. So, wow, we are in quite a pickle here, right? So then Rainsford's like, okay, listen, what are the stakes then? You said there are high stakes. So if I win, what happens? And then the general's like, you know, we will just drop you off. Like my sloop, my boat will just take you to the mainland. Do you really believe that? We've already painted the general, one as this Russian aristocrat who served like a dictator or somebody who had to be toppled and then had to flee from there in order to preserve his own life, right? And then he created an island where he's hunting men. So you already know that he was a depraved person in the first place. You don't get to this place just because you're bored. You get to this place just because it's in you, right? So he's like, all right, so I'll drop you off in town after you win. And then he read Rainsford's mind, which was like, oh, I'm telling everybody because you're behind you gotta get locked up or you gotta be stopped, whatever stop means, right? And so the general's like, oh no, 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 no. See, when I drop you off, you know, wait, hold on. I might not even be able to drop you off anymore, but you know what? We'll talk about that later. What? So you already know that he's actually kind of gonna go back on his word. He's like, yeah, you'll live, but how long do you think he would live? Because now he would have to be on the island with this guy because now he's too afraid to take him back to civilization. He's like, don't tell nobody. And Rainsford's like, oh, I'm gonna tell everybody. Like Rainsford is like, I'm a snitch because yes, I'm telling everybody, you gotta be stopped. But anyway, so now the Cossack, and oh, that's the other interesting thing that the author did, because you know, it's one thing to get caught up in the story, and the story is, you know, raising its stakes, right? And this is the problem. This, remember, I just talked about that in the exposition. We got our two main characters. We have other characters such as Ivan and the island itself, right? We also have the setting, right? So again, the island is the setting, setting also acting as a character. Um, so we do have that setting, but we also setting also is time of place. It's place, time of place, but I would also argue, if that's not one of those things, that setting is also atmosphere. It's also mood. It's also, you know, basically social conditioning, right? Actually, that is part of the setting. So that's not an argument for me. That's what it is. And so the society of this island is that hunting is allowed. Yvonne's not protesting. In fact, Yvonne's part of the problem. The dogs aren't protesting because they're trained to do what they got to do. Whoever's cooking, I don't know what they're doing. Like, there's obviously other people on this island because they cook um to the level that is of nobility, right? So we have that situation going on, and they're not saying anything because I'm pretty sure they don't want to be part of the hunting games either, right? Um, so we have that going on. So, like I said, it's one thing to pay attention to the story, but you also have to pay attention to the author. The author here, now he's been calling him the general, right? You see that the general here, earlier, the general's here. But when he got to talking about you can trust me, the author reminded you that he cannot be trusted. The author didn't call him a general, a man of respect, like a title of respect. The author reminded you what he told you earlier in the story, that Cossacks are savages and that he himself is one too. So when he's like, oh, you can trust me, said the Cossack. This is the first time in this story that the author doesn't call him general or Zaroff or anything of that nature. He reminds you that this is a savage we're talking to, somebody who's not going to keep their word, right? So we have, and then he says that I'll keep my word as a gentleman and a sportsman. But again, we were reminded that he's not a gentleman. We were reminded that. So you got to hold on to this information because that's given to you by the author. Okay. And then the other thing here, and then he's like, yeah, we'll just talk about that over a glass of wine. Bro, literally, after you try to hunt me, I'm gonna drink wine with you. We gonna toast, we gonna be friends, we gonna be bosom buddies, we gonna live on this island together. Like, try that again. All right, let's pick back up with the reading. All right, so now we're in the rising action. And as you know from our last conversation, rising action is where things get a little tight. The tension grows, the suspense builds, because we're going to be meeting conflict after conflict. It's about to get a little difficult. All right, so again, we are now at the part where he just gave Yvonne, or he just mentioned that Yvonne's going to handle him. He's like, I'm going to go take a nap. You don't get to sleep. That's where we are. From another door came Yvonne. Under one arm, he carried khaki hunting clothes, a haversack of food, a leather sheath containing a long bladed hunting knife. His right hand rested on a cocked revolver thrust in the crimson sash of his waist. Rainsford had fought his way through the bush for 2 hours. I must keep my nerve. I must keep my nerve, he said through tight teeth. He had not been entirely clear-headed when the chateau gates snapped shut behind him. His whole idea at first was to put distance between himself and General Zaroff, and to this end, he had plunged along, spurred on by the sharp rowels of something very like panic. But he had got a grip on himself, had stopped, and was taking stock of himself and the situation. He saw that the straight flight was futile. Inevitably, it would bring him face to face with the sea. He was in a picture with a frame of water, and his operations clearly must take place within that frame. So if you remember, when he was swimming and he was climbing up out of the sea and landing on that beach, we saw that the chateau had 3 sides anchored by the cliff, protected by the cliff. So what that means is the way that he came in is the way that he's going to have to go out, right? At least we think, because all that is around him is the water. So that was a beautiful piece of imagery where it said he was in a picture frame of water. Like he had to just operate in that little tight area that he had, which is interesting to try to live for 3 days, right? I'll give him a trail to follow, muttered Rainsford, and he struck off from the rude path he had been following into the trackless wilderness. He executed a series of intricate loops. He doubled on his trail again and again, recalling all the lore of the fox hunt and all of the dodges of the fox. Night found him leg weary, with hands and face lashed by the branches on a thickly wooded ridge. He knew it would be insane to blunder on through the dark, even if he had the strength. His need for rest was imperative, and he thought, I have played the fox. Now I must play the cat of the fable. A big tree with a thick trunk and outspread branches was nearby, and taking care to leave not the slightest mark, he climbed up into the crutch and, stretching out on one of the broad limbs, after a fashion, rested. Rest brought him new confidence and almost a feeling of security. Even so zealous a hunter as General Zaroff could not trace him there, he told himself. Only the devil himself could follow the complicated trail through the jungle after dark. And perhaps, but perhaps, the general was a devil. So let's walk back a little bit. So he was actually starting to make the same mistake everybody else did, right? Because it said the rude path, rude meaning not cultivated, so there was already a path there though, and he was following it, like, the gates closed and you just beat for wherever you can go. So there was some kind of path there. And there would be. This is several nights of hunting, or however often Zaroff hunted. And so there was a path from other people to follow. And he was like, let me stop. Let me think. Let me gather my wits. In other words, let me stop playing on the defense and get on the offense. Let me figure out what the play is going to be so that I am being proactive and not reactive. Because when you're reactive, you're actually not thinking, you're going off of the energies that were put out to you. But when you are proactive, you're the one in control, putting out the energy, and others would have to react to you. So he put his head together. And this is a really interesting thing, because immediately, as soon as he's out there, as soon as he's in the forest, the first thing that he thinks of is one of the animals he hunted, the fox. Probably one of the first animals he hunted, because that was a cultivated thing to do. So he immediately started thinking like an animal. If you remember our conversation from the very beginning, animals can't reason. Animals don't have feelings. Immediately, we're put in the mind of a fox. And foxes are known to be cunning and sly. And so he needed to do that. And so he just did these loops and loops and loops and loops, and like just marking trails everywhere for the guy to get confused and follow. And then he climbed up a tree, because now he's like the next one, a cat. All right. So he climbed into a tree, and it had a nice little bow, like, the thing that you can lay down in. Again, if you were thinking hunting games, because I'm pretty sure that's where she got this from, the Hunger Games, Katniss falls asleep in a tree, right? That the arms of a tree. And that's the same thing we have here. Told you. An apprehensive night crawled slowly by like a wounded snake, and sleep did not visit Rainsford, although the silence of a dead world was on the jungle. Tomorrow morning, when a dingy gray was varnishing the sky, the cry of some startled bird focused Rainsford's attention in that direction. Something was coming through the bush, coming slowly, carefully, coming by the same winding way Rainsford had come. He flattened himself down on the limb, and through a screen of leaves almost as thick as the tapestry, he watched. That which was approaching was a man. It was General Zaroff. He had made his way along with his eyes fixed in the utmost concentration on the ground before him. He paused, almost beneath the tree, dropped to his knees, and studied the ground. Rainsford's impulse was to hurl himself down like a panther, but he saw that the general's right hand held something metallic, a small automatic pistol. The hunter shook his head several times, as if he were puzzled. Then he straightened up and took from his case one of his black cigarettes. Its pungent, incense-like smoke floated up to Rainsford's nostrils. Pungent meaning rank, like really, really strong. Not a good smell. Rainsford held his breath. The general's eyes had left the ground and were traveling inch by inch up the tree. Rainsford froze there, every muscle tensed for a spring. But the sharp eyes of the hunter stopped before they reached the limb where Rainsford lay. A smile spread over his brown face. Very deliberately, he blew a smoke ring into the air. Then he turned his back on the tree and walked carelessly away, back along the trail he had come. The swish of the underbrush against his hunting boots grew fainter and fainter. The pent-up air burst hotly from Rainsford's lungs. His first thought made him feel sick and numb. The general could follow a trail through the woods at night. He could follow an extremely difficult trail. He must have uncanny powers. Only by the merest chance had the Cossack failed to see his quarry. Rainsford's second thought was even more terrible. It sent a shudder of cold horror through his whole being. Why had the general smiled? Why had he turned his back? Rainsford did not want to believe what his reason told him was true, but the truth was as evident as the sun that had by now pushed through the morning mists. The general was playing with him. The general was saving him for another day's sport. The Cossack was the cat. He was the mouse. Then it was that Rainsford knew the full meaning of terror. Let's back up. This is the part where I was like, I love this story. Because this was just brilliant in its subtlety and subtext. Like the stuff that is below, you have to make the connections. You have to understand what was being said. And yes, Richard Connell, the author, does put it together for you at the end. But when we back up, right, we're going to back up a little bit here. So first of all, we can see that we're now calling the general a devil, right? We said perhaps. We didn't call him one, but we now did, right? And then the night was long, right? And Rainsford's chilling in the tree. He can't go to sleep. He doesn't want to fall, but at least he's resting. Because remember, he made all these trails, so his legs were hurting and he's resting. And so he's at the top of the tree. But then daybreak is actually happening. So the dingy gray was varnishing the sky. So daybreak was actually happening. Dawn was coming. So we really are at the end of the night when he sees a bird shoot out of the tree. And that's when he knows somebody's coming. And that ends up being Zara, right? And so remember, Rainsford only has a knife. You have to be close with a knife in order to, hurt somebody who's trying to hurt you. And he saw he was never going to get that close because the general had a gun, which is no match, a knife is no match for. So he was like, stop, don't do that, right? Because again, he's still human. So even though he was thinking to throw himself down like a panther and just like try to take him out, like if you imagine that, he in his humanity was like, let me not do that because I know what that is, right? So now the other interesting thing, because like I said, pay attention to what the author does. The interesting thing here is the author now calls Zaroff the hunter. Because he's saying the hunter, that lets you know that the author now no longer considers Rainsford to be a hunter anymore. Rainsford is now prey. Rainsford is now the quarry. That's what that word means. Ooh. So even the author has shifted for you what we're reading. So the hunter now very, very, very firmly means Zaroff, no longer Rainsford, even though we started off with Rainsford being the hunter. And this is the part that I absolutely thought was like so delicious, right? So he's studying everything and, he's like looking everything. And then it says here, the general's eyes left the ground and start traveling up the tree where Rainsford is. So the general knows. He's figuring out that Rainsford is in this tree. And he goes so far up the tree, right? Like if this was a movie, and they did make a movie out of this, but if this was a movie, this is the part where it's getting so tense, right? That suspense is building, right? Um, there's a great movie producer for and director, and his name is Alfred Hitchcock. He's made like the scariest things because they're psychological. So it's like The Birds, Psycho, Rear Window, all these psychological horrors. And one of the things that's attributed to him is something called the ticking bomb under the table, meaning if you're telling a story, you're and you the audience, this is what you're aware of, right? And we'll get into ironies and things in later videos, but this is considered dramatic irony. This is the ticking bomb under the table. You are very much aware as the reader, as the watcher, that Rainsford is in the tree. So as we read about the general's eyes going up the tree where Rainsford is, we're just waiting for something to happen. And so the suspense is the bomb going to go off or not, right? In the Alfred Hitchcock example, but in this story, is the general going to find Rainsford like right now? Like, is there going to be a confrontation like right now? Is a knife really going to be enough for a gun like right now? And what we get here is, this is the part that's like, what? What we get there is, right? So the general's eyes travel up the tree inch by slow inch. So he could have just went, he didn't. He was like, and then here's the sick part, right? So mind you, he has this smoke, this cigarette, right? So he smiles. Can you imagine being Rainsford in this tree, trying not to move, trying not to breathe, trying not to rustle a tree or a leaf, okay? And you're watching this man who enjoys hunting people as his eyes go up the tree following you. And by the way, they did this in the Hunger Games. So it goes up the tree and you're like frozen. And then all of a sudden the man smiles. The man smiles. And not only does he smile, he very deliberately blew a smoke ring, a ring of smoke, so that it would come up and touch you. And then, y'all, these three things: the smile, the smoke, and then he turned his back on him. Why would you turn your back on somebody who could potentially kill you? Because you don't find them to be a threat. How scary this moment had to be. And then it said he not only turned his back, he just walked carelessly. He's like, you can't do nothing to me. I'm not worried. And he just walks back. And mind you, it is daybreak. So he's like, we'll call this day one. We'll just say it's over. And he just walks back. Heck yeah, I'm scared. Heck yeah, I'm scared. All right, y'all ready to pick up? And we're nearly done. This story goes fast because that's what happens. The exposition's the long part, and then we fly by. So let's get ready to jump back in. I will not lose my nerve. I will not, said Rainsford. He slid down from the tree and struck off again into the woods. His face was set, and he forced the machinery of his mind to function. 300 yards from his hiding place, he stopped where a huge dead tree leaned precariously on a smaller living one. Precariously means dangerously. Throwing off his sack of food, Rainsford took his knife from its sheath and began to work with all his energy. The job was finished at last, and he threw himself down behind a fallen log 100 feet away. He did not have to wait long. The cat was coming again to play with the mouse. Following the trail with the sureness of a bloodhound came General Zaroff. Nothing escaped those searching black eyes. No crushed blade of grass, no bent twig, no mark, no matter how faint, in the moss. So intent was the Cossack on his stalking that he was upon the thing Rainsford had made before he saw it. His foot touched the protruding bough that was the trigger, and even as he touched it, the general sensed his danger and leaped back with the agility of an ape. But he was not quick enough. The dead tree, delicately adjusted to rest on the cut living one, crashed down and struck the general a glancing blow on the shoulder as it fell. But for his alertness, he must have been smashed beneath it. He staggered, but he did not fall, nor did he drop his revolver. He stood there, rubbing his injured shoulder, and Rainsford, with fear again gripping his heart, heard the general's mocking laugh ring through the jungle. Rainsford, called the general, if you are within the sound of my voice, as I suppose you are, let me congratulate you. Not many men know how to make a Malay man-catcher. Luckily for me, I too have hunted in Malacca. You are proving interesting, Mr. Rainsford. I'm going now to have my wound dressed. It's only a slight one, but I shall be back. I shall be back. When the general, nursing his bruised shoulder, had gone, Rainsford took up his flight again. It was flight now, a desperate, hopeless flight that carried him on for some hours. Dusk came, then darkness, and still he pressed on. The ground grew softer under his moccasins. The vegetation grew ranker, denser. Insects bit him savagely. Uh-oh, y'all. Then, as he stepped forward, his foot sank into the ooze. He tried to wrench it back, but the muck sucked viciously at his foot as if it were a giant leech. With a violent effort, he tore his foot loose. He knew where he was now, Death Swamp and its quicksand. His hand was tight closed as if his nerve was something tangible that someone in the darkness was trying to tear from his grip. The softness of the earth had given him an idea. He stepped back from the quicksand, a dozen feet or so, and, like some huge prehistoric beaver, he began to dig. Rainsford had dug himself in France when a second's delay meant death. That had been a placid pastime compared to his digging now. The pit grew deeper. When it was above his shoulders, he climbed out and from some hard saplings cut stakes and sharpened them to a fine point. These stakes he planted into the bottom of the pit with the points sticking up. With flying fingers, he wove a rough carpet of weeds and branches, and with it he covered the mouth of the pit. Then, wet with sweat and aching with tiredness, he crouched behind the stump of a lightning-charred tree. He knew his pursuer was coming. Before we jump right back into the story, I want to take an opportunity to remind you that there is an activity book that goes right along with the story that is called The Ultimate Most Dangerous Game Activity Book. Very creative, I know. But it's right here at this link. You can follow it here, or you can click the link in the show notes and get further into enjoying this story, seeing and testing how much you know, how much you remember from all this beautiful work that we've been doing over these last two videos. So visit the show notes after we're done reading and grab your copy of The Ultimate Most Dangerous Game Activity Book today. He knew his pursuer was coming. He heard the padding sound of feet on the soft earth, and the night breeze brought him the perfume of the general's cigarette. It seemed to Rainsford that the general was coming with unusual swiftness. He was not feeling his way along, foot by foot. Rainsford, crouching there, could not see the general, nor could he see the pit. He lived a year in a minute. Then he felt an impulse to cry aloud with joy, for he heard the sharp crackle of the breaking branches as the cover of the pit gave away. He heard the sharp scream of pain as the pointed stakes found their mark. He leaped up from his place of concealment, then he cowered back down. 3 feet from the pit, a man was standing with an electric torch in his hand. "You've done well, Rainsford," the voice of the general called. "Your Burmese tiger pit has claimed one of my best dogs. Again, you score. I think, Rainsford, I'll see what you can do against my whole pack. I'm going home for a rest now. Thank you for a most amusing evening." Y'all, he already talked about his other dog, Lazarus, who, by the way, had a very, very important name. Lazarus is a name that was inside of the Bible. And that was a man who apparently Jesus raised from the dead. So for his dog to be named Lazarus, and that's the one that was claimed, was quite interesting. Fast forward to where we are in the story, yet another dog is sacrificed during this hunt. And you know the general's not going to take that well. He did not take well the loss of his other dog. So now this cost him something. And this was still just day 2, right? So again, day 1 was the tree. Day 2, general got hurt. And because he got hurt, he went and grabbed a dog. And now he's like, time to up the stakes, Mr. Rainsford, because obviously you're doing very well man on man. So what about you with other things? And again, y'all, this was in Hunger Games. Remember, they released the dogs to try to take care of Katniss and Peter. So the other thing too is we're going to talk about a new term, and this is called a hyperbole. A hyperbole is an exaggeration. So in this case, our hyperbole is this line right here. He lived a year in a minute. That's a condensing of time. How can you live 365 days in 1 minute? That's how long it felt for him to be sitting there waiting for the general to arrive, right? So the hyperbole's job is for you to see how ridiculous something can be, but also to make you feel what the character is feeling. And so in this instance, I don't know if you've ever done a plank before, but if you've ever done a plank, then you know how long a minute could really be. When it's something you enjoy, 5 minutes could fly by. But when it's something that is painful, each second is a tick on the clock. And as he said, he lived a year in a minute. And then he got something, right? He heard the crack and he didn't know General went to go cheat because the general is a cheat. Let's be very clear. He didn't say anything about him bringing in hunting dogs. He said it was going to be him and him. You know, it was going to be man on man, mano a mano. But no, he went and cheated. He went and got a dog. And so Rainsford thought he got the general. And can you imagine? Like, yes, no. Luckily, he didn't say anything, right? Otherwise, that would have been over. So now we are moving into day 3. Day 3. Oh my gosh. Let's jump into it. At daybreak, Rainsford, lying near the swamp, was awakened by a sound that made him know that he had new things to learn about fear. It was a distant sound, faint and wavering, but he knew it. It was the baying of a pack of hounds. Okay, baying is going to be that barking, they're looking for it. They're looking for the animal that they're hunting, right? Rainsford knew he could do one of 2 things. He could stay where he was and wait. That was suicide. He could flee. That was postponing the inevitable. So it's like, I do or I do, right? And so for a moment, he stood there thinking, reasoning. An idea that held a wild chance came to him, and tightening his belt, he headed away from the swamp. The baying of the hounds drew nearer, then still nearer, nearer, ever nearer. On a ridge, Rainsford climbed a tree. Down a watercourse, not a quarter of a mile away, he could see the bush moving. Straining his eyes, he saw the lean figure of General Zara. Just ahead of him, Rainsford made out another figure whose wide shoulders surged through the tall jungle weeds. It was the giant Yvonne, and he seemed pulled forward by some unseen force. Rainsford knew that Yvonne must be holding the pack in leash. They would be on him any minute now. His mind worked frantically. He thought of a native trick he had learned in Uganda. He slid down the tree. He caught hold of a springy young sapling, and to it he fastened his hunting knife, with the blade pointing down the trail. With a bit of wild grapevine, he tied back the sapling, and then he ran for his life. The hounds raised their voices as they caught the fresh scent. Rainsford knew now how an animal at bay feels. He had to stop to get his breath. The baying of the hounds stopped abruptly, and Rainsford's heart stopped too. They must have reached the knife. He shimmied excitedly up a tree and looked back. His pursuers had stopped, but the hope that was in Rainsford's brain when he climbed died. For he saw in the shallow valley that General Zaroff was still on his feet. But Ivan was not. The knife, driven by the recoil of the springing tree, had not wholly failed. Rainsford had hardly tumbled to the ground when the pack took up the cry again. Nerve, 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 he panted as he dashed along. A blue gap showed between the trees dead ahead. Ever nearer drew the hounds. Rainsford forced himself on toward that gap. He reached it. It was the shore of the sea. Across a cove, he could see the gloomy gray stone of the chateau. 20 feet below him, the sea rumbled and hissed. Rainsford hesitated. He heard the hounds. Then he leaped far out into the sea. When the general and his pack reached the place by the sea, the Cossack stopped. For some minutes, he stood regarding the blue-green expanse of water. He shrugged his shoulders. Then he sat down, took a drink of brandy from a silver flask, lit a cigarette, and hummed a bit from Madame Butterfly, which was an opera. Again, that savagery juxtaposed, there's your new term, put up next to civilized. It is what would be considered disconcerting. It's what would give people like question, pause, confusion. Because how can you, as a savage man, be hunting another man, but humming opera, which the nobility, the rich, get to enjoy because of their civilized behavior, their upper crust lives? That juxtaposition, those two things next to each other, juxta means next to, juxta means like together, and position means where they are. So juxta, next to, together, position together. So the juxtaposition of those two unlike things create what we call a paradox, right? So a paradox is essentially that. So a paradox is when we have two contradicting ideas that seem like they can't be true, but they are. So in this case, we do have a brute of a man, a savage of a man who's also civilized. He loves the good things, but he's that guy, like that guy. So a paradox is things that just don't seem like they could be true, but they are. It just doesn't make sense. It's like the time warp, whenever you watch one of the Marvel type of movies or any movie of that nature where they do this time traveling, that in itself creates a paradox, because how can two things exist? But in the movie, in the realm of that, they do. It's just, for me, I'm always having a question of, when does the loop end? Like, when is it truly not a loop of things? I'm just going to stop right there. But anyway, so that's the paradox that we're dealing with. And so that's one of your new words. All right, we are near the end. So let's actually back up and talk about what it is that just took place, what it is that actually just happened. So day 3, again, stakes raised, right? And the stakes were raised so high. Why? Because the rule, the promise, the game is survive 3 days and you're free. You were going to be free to go, but we were going to talk about that later, because obviously you're not going to keep your mouth shut, right? So you're free. And so we are on the 3rd day. So for the general, it's like, oh, I can't do it by myself. So he went and got too much help, which was not part of the game. So he went and got Ivan, and Ivan's the only strong one, because, the general's a little wispy. Bad guys hardly ever do their own work. And so Ivan is leading this pack of dogs, lots of dogs, because he's already killed one dog. And so, The general is pulling out all the stops. He is going to cheat. He is cheating. And what Rainsford did was, again, another trap that he learned from his travels and from hunting, is set up a spring trap so that when they crossed it, when they passed that little vine, somebody like trips it, it and it took out Yvonne. So, and that's a good thing in a way, in a way, because even if he had got rid of General Zaroff, he still would have had Yvonne to deal with, and Yvonne didn't make the rules, so Yvonne didn't have to hold them. He didn't have to honor them, and also he had a pack of dogs. So, you know, so it's kind of good he took out one of his adversaries, but here he's left with the main guy, right? The one who actually created the game. And so he's left. And so Rainsford has no choice. It's like, stay here and let you kill me, which I got pride. That's not going to happen. Or I can take that 1% permutation, that 1% chance that I can survive again these terrible waters. And why is it that he knows that there's a chance that he could survive it? Because he has before. He's fallen into it before. He swam it before. He's escaped before. He's escaped the water before. So he figures he could do it again, right? And all he had to do was survive the night. And so he obviously is. And they gave him like hardly any time to rest, right? All right. So he chose to take his 1% chance as if Dr. Strange was there, giving him, there's one way, one possibility. And so he took it. Y'all ready to find out what happens as a result of this? Let's go. General Zaroff had an exceedingly good dinner in his great panel dining hall that evening. With it, he had a bottle of Pol Roger and half a bottle of Chambertin. I don't know how to pronounce these, y'all, but I'm not letting it stop me. I'm going to keep reading. So there's a thing for you. Two slight annoyances kept him from perfect enjoyment. One was the thought that it would be difficult to replace Yvonne. The other was that his quarry had escaped him, of course. The American hadn't played the game, so thought the general as he tasted his after-dinner liquor. In his library, he read to soothe himself from the works of Marcus Aurelius. At 10, he went up to his bedroom. He was deliciously tired, he said to himself as he locked himself in. There was a little moonlight, so before turning on his light, he went to the window and looked down at the courtyard. He could see the great hounds, and he called, "Better luck next time," to them. Then he switched on the light. A man who had been hiding in the curtains of the bed was standing there. "Rainsford!" screamed the general. "How in God's name did you get here?" "Swam," said Rainsford. "I found it quicker than walking through the jungle." The general sucked in his breath and smiled. "I congratulate you," he said. "You have won the game." Rainsford didn't smile. "I'm still a beast at bay," he said in a low, hoarse voice. "Get ready, General Zara." The general made one of his deepest bows. "I see," he said. "Splendid. One of us is to furnish a repast for the dogs." In other words, that body will be tossed out the window so the dogs can have food. The other will sleep in this very excellent bed. On God, Rainsford. He had never slept in a better bed, Rainsford decided. And the story ended exactly how it was supposed to end, y'all. So it was really delicious. I love this story. Of course, you can conjecture what. What can you possibly guess here with this final line? Because again, given that General Zaroff said, one of us will be dinner for the hounds, and the other is going to sleep in the bed. And then it says, Rainsford never slept in a better bed. it wasn't that Rainsford was thinking, I never slept in a better bed. He decided, which means he's in it, which means he won. Because again, as he said, and as the general knew, I'm still a beast at bay. I'm still going to be hunted by you. I can't sleep if you exist. So again, it's a good thing he got rid of Yvonne, because remember, Yvonne is the threat that made other people have to play the game. So if there's no Yvonne to hold that threat, then we're not dealing with it, right? But again, the general still exists. And so the game doesn't get to end. It just doesn't get to end until this is over, all the way over. And now he can get on that sloop, he can get on that boat, and he can go back to civilization. But first, we sleep, we rest. I hope you enjoyed that story. Y'all let me know what you thought about the story. Let me know what you thought about the author's telling of the story. Did you enjoy that? Again, we have some terms that we learned in this particular part of the story. We learned about paradox. We learned, again, another type of irony. Let's go ahead and real quick go over the plot device here, right? So we covered exposition, we covered rising action. What I love about the story is that the climax, which is known as the top of a story, it's where it gets no higher. The suspense is at the highest that it possibly could be. What I love about this is that the author literally put us at the highest point of the island. Because if you remember, the climax is I either stay here or die, right? Because the climax is a do or die point. Like I either make my choice and follow through or I don't, right? So here we get that he went right back up the tree. He looked to make sure that Zaroff got killed, and he didn't. It was Yvonne, right? So he's like, darn it, it's what it is. But then he saw that the dogs and Zaroff was coming back. But it shows you here that he was at the top of the cliff. He's on the cliff. So we're literally cliffhanging. Like we're literally at the top of the island. And so he jumps right off. And that literally, as he falls into the sea, we're now in falling action of the plot point. So the climax is a decision and action that has to be made, and that happens. So the falling action is going to be the result of that decision. And so what happens is, as a result of that decision, we don't actually see it. Y'all, we really don't see the falling action, which was literally Rainsford falling into the sea, Rainsford having to swim through the sea again, Rainsford having to make his way back to the chateau, Rainsford having to sneak into the chateau, past Zaroff. We don't see any of that. And that is where falling action really takes place, because we get here where the conclusion of it, because remember, the problem that we're trying to solve is to survive the game, right? We're trying to not be killed. And so when he gets that congratulation from General Zaroff, right? Literally, he's like, you have won the game. Boom. There we have the next part, resolution. The problem solved. I won. But the truth is, knowing who the general is, there's a loose end, so to speak. You know, we got to tie the loose end. We got to stop it so that there's no knot. So this other part, and most people don't talk about this because this is something that we really do talk about in movies. I am a screenwriter as well, y'all. So we got to the resolution, but there's something, it's a French word, it's called denouement. And so the denouement, D-E-N-O-U-M-E-N-T, denouement, that is the part where we tie up the loose ends. We tie them up. And so having to get rid of Zaroff so that we can ensure we get into a boat, so that we can ensure we get back to our life. We had to tie that up. And so this part right here, this part right here, the whole after the game, this part right here, after we have the resolution of you have won the game, so we won, that solves the problem. We are now in what we call the denouement. We are now in wrapping up the loose ends, tying them up, because we don't need a part 2 of this story. We don't. Now, and there we go. And that's the end. Again, I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please like, subscribe. There's more to come. Our next story is going to be one of my favorites. Again, it's another hunting story. It is called A Sound of Thunder by one of my favorite authors, Ray Bradbury. If you like this writing, you're going to love that too. It's delicious. So I will see you in the next video. Don't forget, get your activity book that goes along with this one. Bye now.